The Republican National Convention concluded last night with Donald Trump delivering an address as the party's official presidential nominee. It was Trump's first public remark since an assassination attempt on his life over the weekend. He promised big things, including changes to U.S. trade relations.
We have long been taken advantage of by other countries. And think of it, oftentimes these other countries are considered so-called allies. They've taken advantage of us for years. We lose jobs, we lose revenue, and they gain everything and wipe out our businesses, wipe out our people. I stopped it for 4 years, I stopped it, and we're really ready to make changes like nobody had seen before.
One of those promises is a 10% tariff on all foreign imports coming into the U.S., which could include Canada. But CBC News has learned that Canada is already in talks with members of Trump's circle about avoiding new trade tariffs if he's elected this fall. Earlier this week, Canada's ambassador to the U.S., Kirsten Hillman, spoke to Power and Politics about protecting the Canada-U.S. trade relationship.
Where we have to make sure that we get to, in any conversation with an American that is disinclined towards free trade and disinclined towards globalization, is to say, okay, your policy objectives may be what they are, but if you really want to secure a safe, prosperous, resilient United States, then free trade with Canada is essential.
Laura Dawson is the Executive Director of Future Borders Coalition. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
So Trump seems to be in a strong position. He's leading in every battleground state. And if an election were held today, he'd probably be president again. I'm going to ask you something that everyone in this country wants to know. Do you think a Trump 2.0 is good or bad news for Canada?
I think a Trump 2.0 is going to be very difficult for Canada. I think Americans are entitled to vote for whoever they want to, but it's going to be really challenging. And I don't think that we have lessons enough from Trump 1.0. I think he's going to come back much stronger, much more aggressive, and much more focused. And unfortunately, Canada will be in the crosshairs in some of his actions.
He certainly focused on trade again, something that we dealt with in the first four-year term. And he's talking now about the possibility of a universal tariff, something that would apply to allies, including Canada, a 10% tariff if he's elected in November. How damaging would something like that be for this country?
Hugely damaging, but let's think back to 1930. Students of history remember the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which the U.S. imposed similarly as what's being proposed here, 10,000 products, and it helped to trigger a global depression. One of the reasons why that depression took hold is because the U.S. actions, which were to protect its own producers, triggered retaliatory tariffs from Canada in particular, which was the largest buyer of U.S. products then as now. And those retaliatory tariffs prompted a closing down of the global trading system. We're much more integrated now than we were then, so we can only imagine the implications of a 10% universal tariff.
Yeah, maybe speak a little bit more about that. CBC News is reporting today that the Canadian ambassador to the U.S. is already lobbying some Trump campaign officials trying to get Canada exempted from this possible universal tariff that could be applied if Trump is elected. And there's talk about, as you say, retaliatory tariffs, that if this comes from the U.S., Canada would slap some on of their own. Is that something that could prompt a larger trade war? Is it something that we should be really concerned about as we look at the possibility of another Trump presidency?
Yeah, it's definitely something to be concerned about. I'm really pleased that Ambassador Hillman and her team and all of the advocates on behalf of Canada are out there warning against it. We did see back in Trump 1.0, when he was contemplating a similar action, he was shown a map of agricultural export destinations by Ag Secretary Sonny Perdue. And when it really hit home for him then that Canada was the largest buyer of U.S. ag products, he dialed it back. So I'm glad that they're out doing this advocacy. At the same time, I don't want people I wouldn't be lulled by a sense that, hey, we've got the NAFTA, we've got the USMCA, it'll be fine. I don't think it'll be fine. I think the president would impose, at least on a short-term basis, tariffs that would supersede or override those trade agreements. And I don't think we can rely on the 1989 Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. If this is someone who's willing to rip up the USMCA, abide by no trade commitments, then certainly the Canada-US agreement would not be spared as well.
That's one of the arguments that we're actually hearing from Canadian officials, is that the USMCA is in place and that these sort of tariffs are a no-go, and that they would be on flimsy legal ground to impose something like this on Canada, given we have that trilateral trade deal. You're saying don't rely on the new NAFTA. That might not save us in this case.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think Trump takes a certain amount of pride in having renegotiated a NAFTA, and he likes the top line messaging of getting a better deal for the U.S. But he is not bound by internal logic and legal niceties. If he gets it into his head that he's going to do something, he's going to do it unless some very strong actors near to him are able to intercede and say, "Okay, Mr. President, this is all the ways that this will affect U.S. interests and look bad on you." And so we need that counter narrative and those U.S. influencers really mobilized for Canada.
Speaking of the new NAFTA, we know that it could be up for renegotiation as soon as 2026. A lot of Canadians are thinking, what? That again already? I feel like we just dealt with that, but here we are, right? That could be something that will be discussed between the two sides during a possible Trump presidency. What are you expecting on that front? Do you think that that trade deal is at risk of being ripped up, or could there be major changes? I mean, I know it's hard to speak now with some authority on it, but what are you expecting could come from a Trump presidency, given that so many of its officials are quite protectionist in nature?
Sure. I mean, there's no airspace between a anti-trade election campaign and the USMCA Kuzma new NAFTA review. The U.S. has to get its wish list submitted by January of 2025. So it starts very, very soon. And because this is a new thing emanating from a suggestion that there be a sunset clause, it's a watered down sunset clause. But what it does is, if the three parties can't recommit to that agreement next year, it will go into this year by year annual review purgatory. It's neither here or there, and it could potentially be ripped up by 2036 if they can't come to a deal. So if you're an investor and you're considering investing in Canada or expanding your manufacturing in Canada, you may have second thoughts about coming to Canada or Mexico, because the very foundations of the North American trade relationship could be in question. And so perversely, the U.S. could start a destabilizing process that it also benefits from in terms of investment diversion and deflection.
What should Canada be doing to avoid a scenario like that?
It should be doing exactly what it's doing now with the Team Canada initiative, but it should be doing it much more and much more broadly. It's got to be reaching the regions, the cities, the congressional districts, and the sectors where there are strong Canadian benefits and Canadian interests. It can't just be ambassadors and ministers. It really needs to hit that local level. Premiers, governors, mayors, sectoral associations. That is huge, especially where we have sectoral associations like aluminum that get together on both sides of the border and say, this is a trade relationship that works. We like Canadian aluminum. We like using it for American manufacturing. Let's not screw this up. I'd like to see that across multi sectors of manufacturing, agriculture, and services.
All right, let's leave it there. Great insights as always. Thank you, Laura Dawson, the Executive Director of Future Borders Coalition. Appreciate you coming on.
You're so welcome. Thank you.
Will Canada be facing a tariff war with its closest trading partner? It's time to bring in our Friday Power Panel. Nigan Sinclair is a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press. Here with me in studio, Sherelle Evelyn is the managing editor of the Hill Times, and journalist and author Paul Wells. So, Sherelle, we're reporting today, CBC News, that Canada's preparing for some retaliatory tariffs. But what's interesting to me is they've already reached out to the Trump team. They're already lobbying them to not go ahead with a plan like this, maybe expecting a victory for Trump in November, or at least preparing for one. Do you think that Canada should be worried about a second Trump presidency?
Well, yeah, worried in the sense that it's possible that it could happen. It's looking more and more likely as time goes on, as the Democrats and Republicans in the United States try to sort themselves out. We've seen this before. Obviously, it's not some out of the realm of possibility that it can happen. We've had a Trump presidency,
Yep.
and the government was kind of caught flat-footed. So it would make a heck of a lot of sense to prepare for this. But there's only so much that you can actually prepare, especially when you're talking about Donald Trump as president, because he will say, there's many things that he will say that people will brush off as like, oh, he would never do that, and then he does them. And then there's other things that you had no idea was even coming. So there's that element of unpredictability. There's only so much you can do. So you have to be laying the groundwork now as much as possible.
Yeah, it's tough dealing with someone who is quite erratic, right? Even last night, he was supposed to deliver a speech that was to unite the country. He veered off script, Paul. But, while that speech is getting some mixed reviews, Trump has had a pretty good week, right? There were some accolades for the Republican National Convention overall. He's leading in every battleground poll, even some states like New Mexico and New Hampshire potentially in play for the Republicans. He certainly has a leg up over Biden right now, who's down for the count with COVID and facing an insurrection really within his own party. What are you looking for as Canada stares down the possibility of a second Trump presidency?
You can always tell when this government gets serious, first of all, because it's a change of pace, but also it becomes kind of methodical and systematic. Senior officials have already been organizing a series of tours into the various corners of the United States, not just Washington or not just New York, but Minnesota and Idaho and so on, and making every company, every state house, every city government that depends on trade with Canada cognizant of that fact and alerting them to the dangers of that trade being eroded. That will probably have an effect. I mean, I've seen Trump almost be president before, and people start telling them stories about how, remember Kevin O'Leary saying that it would be like Godzilla versus Bambi, his relations with Trudeau. Turns out Bambi had friends, and Canada always will in the United States. And so I don't think we're doomed to an existential threat to the Canada-U.S. relationship, so much as we are likely to have to go through another pedagogical exercise for this president, where he will learn that American interests are harmed when trade is harmed, and that those American interests howl and they vote. And that will take some time, but it'll probably have the desired effect.
Yeah, I was speaking to Laura Dawson earlier on the program. She's an expert in Canada-U.S. relations, and she was expressing off camera in a different conversation, frustration with the Americans because she continually has to remind them of the value of Canada, right? It doesn't quite stick, right? They have to launch this campaign each and every time there's a threat of trade action against Canada. And as you mentioned, fanning out across the country, we know that Minister Champagne alone has been to New York, Michigan, Ohio, Georgia, New Jersey, Nebraska, and D.C. over the last number of weeks.
And that was probably before he was asked.
Right. Exactly. He's like the Energizer Bunny, and he's obviously down in the U.S. trying to make the case. Nigan, do you think that there's been relative peace here in Canada, right, for the last 3.5 years with Biden? There hasn't been a ton of action on the Canada-U.S. front. It's been pretty quiet. Do you think that the Trudeau government is prepared do they have the stamina to maybe deal with another Trump presidency? Can they handle what's sure to be a raucous time?
Actually, don't think it really matters whether they have stamina or not, because with the federal election coming up and the fact that this government probably is on a clock. But what is of pertinent notice is that by releasing an information or leaking it to media that we are preparing for a Trump presidency really plays into a real political interest of the Trudeau Liberals, which is to begin to paint Poilievre as very favorable to a Trump presidency. We know that the Trump presidency is of deep paranoia to many Canadians, and by leaking out, we're preparing for this, might favor the Trudeau Liberals to say, well, we are the only political party that can address or be a corrective or somehow be in opposition to the Trump forces that may or may not be coming. I'd be very interested to see whether this question would be framed in the same way after this weekend. I mean, there's well known, if anyone's looking at social media and the big American pundits out there, that there is looking at a very serious change among the Democrats of whether Biden will make that shift. I think all the energy and the exuberance that comes out of the Republican National Convention the past few days certainly suggests that the Democrats have to do something to try to move the tide. And if there's anything that we know about Trump, it is that he's doubling down more than ever on making sure that those around him are the biggest yes people of any possible presidency in history. There will be very little corrective to try to deal with this issue of tariffs. But one of the side stories about this is that while we may see a quieting of relationships with Canada between the Trudeau and the Biden legacies, and it may be stepped up, do you know who the direct beneficiary of a 10% tariff will be? It will be Mexico, because all the manufacturing will then go nearby to Mexico. U.S. companies won't be able to afford the labor costs alone to be able to manufacture things within the United States. So it will be Mexico that will be the beneficiary to Trump's great plan.
Yeah, Sherelle, Nigan mentioned Pierre Poilievre in his remarks there. He's in a strong position in the polls in this country, as we've been talking about for weeks on end. And some polls suggest, including one from Abacus Data, David Coletto, a friend of the show, suggests that most Canadians think that Pierre Poilievre would be better dealing with Trump, that he might be better equipped to deal with someone like Donald Trump because maybe some ideological similarities. Do you think that a Trump victory is a good thing for Pierre Poilievre and his political fortunes?
I'm not sure. Honestly, I'm really not sure, because what we haven't really seen from Pierre Poilievre is a really strong interest in foreign policy and international relations. Yep. So we know that there are strong ties, especially now with Donald Trump's vice presidential pick, that Poilievre has people within his caucus who will be able to, maybe make that introduction. But we haven't seen any real interest yet from Pierre Poilievre in terms of going to Washington, like many of his predecessors have done. Mm-hmm. Aaron O'Toole, as leader of the Conservative Party, went to Washington. Andrew Scheer went to Washington. Going back and back and back, and other conservative leaders, before they moved into 24 Sussex or into Stornoway. So we don't really know what he's going to do, but there's also that element of, is he going to be tied to the Trump presidency? The Liberals are very much pushing that. Mm-hmm. They're very much pushing that him as being, Trump light or MAGA-ish and whatever you want to use. So could that hurt him or help him? I'm not sure. Will he be? He talks big, absolutely, but is Trump going to see a like-minded figure? I'm unsure.
Yeah, Paul, you probably heard the chatter in Liberal circles about how a Donald Trump victory could be great for Justin Trudeau, right? I think they're hoping that maybe Canadians will see some of the chaos south of the border, if there is some, and say, hey, we don't want that right-wing populism here in Canada. We're going to stick with Justin Trudeau and the status quo, because Pierre Poilievre would just be a replication of Trump here. So they're kind of thinking, hey, this might not be a bad thing. I mean, they get along with Biden, but politically, Trump might be a boost for the Liberals. What do you think of that?
I mean, it's possible. I suspect that no election outside Canada has a large influence on how Canadians vote in a Canadian election. And I don't think that, the few months of a second Trump administration would greatly influence the outcome of a Canadian federal election. I do think a conservative prime minister governing during a Trump presidency would face challenges. Most Canadians don't like Donald Trump, but most Trump admirers are conservative supporters. And so it's possible that a Canadian prime minister would have to retaliate against or dissent from a Trump administration decision that a lot of conservative voters thought was just fine. And that's a tricky dance, one that we didn't get to see Stephen Harper have to perform, but that we might get to see Pierre Poilievre have to perform. On the other hand, I do think it's entirely possible that a Prime Minister Poilievre would have an easier time getting calls returned from the White House and so on. But I think those two pulls would operate in different directions at different times, and it wouldn't be a cakewalk for Pierre Poilievre. He couldn't expect to get great favors from his buddy Donald Trump. I don't think Donald Trump would be his buddy, and I think that White House would just be a random event generator for any Canadian Prime Minister.
You're gonna have about a minute left, but do you think a Trump victory would be a good thing for the Liberal teams, or is it just too far gone for the Liberals at this point? Is it too tough to claw your way back into the mix?
I think if Trump is to be believed, and by all accounts, as I pointed out just a minute ago, he'll be surrounded by, I think, the most group of yes people that there will be no one who will then stand in the way of Trump's rather egregious, and if there's any indication the last night of the Republican National Convention, really crazy presidency, he will import and bring in some of the most draconian rules quite quickly. There will be such deep chaos. And I do think that Paul's right. A U.S. election may not influence as much about Canadian electoral politics, but I think absolutely when there is chaos, and chaos to the degree that Trump is promising to deliver, I think that certainly will pay into a Trudeau message. And all you have to do is point out that there is a big, massive, let's say, economic challenge, or even a political civil conflict happening in the United States, to say, well, we are the stable party. And I think that will play well for Canadian voters.
All right, let's leave it there. Thank you so much to the Friday Power panel. Sherelle Evelyn, Paul Wells, and Egon Sinclair. Smart thoughts, as always, from you folks. Lots to